I really enjoyed these presentations, and Christina in particular. I was really interested in your horizontal levees and your view for the South Bay. David Sedlak and I, with our center on reinventing urban water infrastructure, have somewhat similar view, not necessarily with the development that would go behind the levee, but we're thinking in terms of horizontal wetlands that would be used to remove nitrogen from water, that would create this freshwater, saltwater habitat known as the ecotone, would provide recreation. The levee itself would protect against sea level rise and the like. So I guess the reason we come to these sort of conferences is to find out areas where we can work together. But your vision there matches very well with ours. We plan a pilot project at Oraloma, where we'll put in this horizontal levee to see how well it works, but how that scales out and what all the other benefits could come to it, and the economic benefits in particular that you describe, I think are just wonderful. So I just see a place where we could work together.
That's great, and I should credit the Bay Institute is the one who developed, the people who developed the horizontal levee idea, not me. But I think there's a way to bring it together with development and not separate conservation, development, and storm protection or flood protection by thinking of this completely artificial edge set up with cells that does provide both habitat, filtration, and housing for people who can afford it. So thank you. I'm glad you're interested, and it'd be great to try to find a way to work together.
Other questions? Yeah.
I guess it's to start with the question to Kala, but I think it's to all of you. It seems like one of the other underlying themes of the ideas you presented is that they might not be taken up by government, but they might be taken up by private industry. And I'm curious about the tension between public management of infrastructure and private for-profit driven management of infrastructure, especially when it comes to modular solutions. So maybe each of you who has an opinion about that could say how it relates to your specific ideas.
In relation to what we've been involved in, I think currently it's the private sector that's innovating, and you're finding the public utilities very nervous and very cautious about what's going on. I mean, they're losing water, and they're in the business of selling water. And I think the challenge for them, and this is what Hamburg Wasser has done, they've recognized that they need to innovate, they need to change, because they're seeing these decentralized modular systems as sort of disruptive technology. And if you look at sort of other disruptive technologies, the big guys sort of ignore these other people entering the market, and then finally they take over the market. I think in developing countries it's a little bit different. The capacity of some of those utilities is very limited, and you're almost seeing them welcome some of these private operators, particularly in the area of sanitation, because sanitation is something that they find very difficult to implement, and these private operators see potential profits where the utility doesn't. So I think it varies, but that's my response.
Yeah, I think that we have to look into ways that the adaptation pathways that we talk about are also pathways for making money. Otherwise, they're not going to happen in a market society, whatever society that is. So the way I look at it, I used to run a public agency for a brief period of time during a crisis, so I know about the politics behind the scenes of changing things. I think if we bring groups like a home builders association, developers, and the environmental community together to do something, then elected officials will follow. And I actually look forward to that we could solve the issue kind of between the parties and then go back to the elected officials and say, we're ready to go.
I mean, there's a principle in the history of technology that any physical object resembles precisely the committee that constructed it in its physical structure, and the for better or for worse. And so I think we need, in a very fundamental way, to think about institutional innovations that that would need to mirror the kind of physical innovations that we're talking about. I mean, I think in the case of this larger work on residual spaces, I mean, one of the things that I find most kind of interesting and sometimes infuriating is that if you look at the programs that most cities in the United States have to deal with vacant and underutilized lands, they're at their very best, their commitments, not to arrest people who are trying to improve the places, and that's the versus the. I would love to see a kind of acknowledgement of a model that incorporates the actual tangible and even computable material benefits that this kind of work brings, because this kind of work tends best to happen. I mean, the model I presented is very top-down in terms of the designs that are being done, but you would never actually imagine doing such a thing in anything other than a bottom-up way, because it is precisely the communities that you would need and want to engage with this kind of work.
I just wanted to add a comment about this, because I think one thing that we haven't talked about, and that is at the root of some of the problems of getting these things done, is the structure of municipal organization and finance. So a lot of the systems that you're talking about that are distributed have, they need to be funded and done usually by departments of public works, but the benefits are diffuse. So you basically have an agency that's unwilling to make those kinds of expenditures because they don't get any revenue from it. And until you have a different way of circulating funds within cities, you're going to have this institutional resistance to projects with concentrated costs and distributed benefits. I think that's a structural problem. So there. I don't know that there's any easy solution to it, by the way. Other questions, comments?
Dr. Vaira Vamuti, the usual way that technology transfer works is from the global north to the global south.
Yeah.
It occurs to me that as we, of necessity, wean ourselves from fossil fuels here in the global north and begin to shift from these high resource intensive infrastructures that we have, that exactly the solutions that you're developing in the global south will be usable by us. So there's a way in which I think we have a lot to learn from the global south.
Yeah, I mean, I completely concur with you. I think if we were to design our cities again, we wouldn't design it the way we've designed them, right? We would design them differently, and the opportunity that you're seeing, particularly in emerging areas, to innovate and to mainstream some of these ideas makes them economically a lot more viable, particularly in dealing with some of the threats that we're potentially going to experience. And that then creates the imperative for change, I think, for larger sort of legacy type cities to think about how they might transition. It's very hard to get existing cities to transition because, we have well-functioning systems that are unsustainable, but they're probably sustainable within the lifetime of a lot of the people that are dealing with it. So you need some other imperative. Usually it's fear or greed that is what kicks people into change. But I think when they see demonstrations of innovation and they see it working and they see it taken to scale, they start realizing that it's all in the mind, It's not a harder way to design. It's not a harder way to do things. It's just that we've been so cultured in doing something in a certain way that we think everything else is not possible. But I agree. It's going to be south-north, I think.
Thank you all for your presentations. My question is, I think all of you have the same underlying themes: decentralization, distributed networks, new models, new ways of doing everything that we've been doing wrong for so long. How can we use social media, internet? How can we get this out to the stakeholders, so that we don't have to pick one sort of software or visualization, program, or the UN's way or somebody else's way? I think we need to get this more widespread in the thinking and these ideas and innovations, mapping and these tools out there more widely. So what are your ideas?
Well, I was lucky to work in Seattle for 10 years, and even though the Seattle process is famous for slowing things down, I think there have been a lot of innovations in very fun ways where they're putting things on YouTube that are part of public planning quickly, quick versions that are well produced. Not quite as well produced as what Nicholas was showing, but still. better produced, so people can get a chance to see what's coming and feel excited and engaged about it, instead of the oppression of sitting through meeting after meeting and not knowing whether your presence matters. And they're also doing things that are really obvious social things, like providing daycare or childcare during the meeting. And by providing childcare during evening meetings, they got a lot of different kinds of people who are not the usual suspects in public participation. So I think that there are some obvious social things that can be done to do that, and then there's some fun media-related things, but both really should happen.
I mean, I think less perhaps on the theme of how do you publicize ideas, and loudly and as much as possible is the general idea on that front. But in terms of thinking about urban governance itself, I think there is a very crucial discourse going on at the moment around the role of information systems in urban administration, and that we are presented, as in terms of your lane-changing metaphor, we're presented with both some very risky possibilities, which is that the centralized information systems centralize decision-making even more, but then compartmentalize it in the ways that Jennifer was talking about earlier. And then there's a model, a kind of utopian model in which a kind of perfect democracy is possible through widespread access to information, which is equally, unlikely or potentially dysfunctional. But that there's some very interesting work going on in the middle, and traditionally the kind of work that thinks about how social media and digital infrastructure is useful in urban administration has been hampered by what has been called the digital divide. But that divide, it exists as a divide in terms of how different communities access digital information, but it no longer so much exists as a divide in terms of underlying access at all. And so I think there's things like the Citrus Data and Democracy project here on campus, a larger kind of movement, groups like Code for America, and I don't think we're doing, even all of that is not nearly the beginnings of enough in terms of the kinds of thinking that is really necessary in terms of how these tools can be used. We've already seen recently how they can be used to create more surveillance, more secret, lack of transparency, et cetera, but there exists an important possibility for the reverse.
So I came from doing, I'm a techie person, but I've come from doing projects where the participatory process has been really essential and really made a difference in terms of sensitizing people to some of these issues and getting greater buy-in. We've made a very strategic appointment at the college that I'm in, and we've appointed an English professor, and he has a very critical role. He's a professor of environmental rhetoric. And his role is really thinking about how you communicate the value of sustainability to different types of stakeholders, and how you use visualization tools, how you use social media to address different types of stakeholders. And we take this very seriously, and it's one of the cornerstones of the master's program when we teach students, is really that process of communicating. And I'm hoping that this particular individual comes up with some of those ideas that you said, so we'll wait and see.
Again, I think the theme is clear about kind of decentralized systems and all of that. But I think that perhaps some of that is, the reason for all that is because of the failure of the larger entities, socio-political entities, the state. And I guess I wonder, what is the role, though, of the state in these kind of approaches to solving these problems? Is there one?
Do you mean the nation state or the
Well, I guess it would be
state?
in the state of a city, in terms of distributed systems within a city or a national state. Particularly in developing country settings.
I think part of the reason we're working on decentralization is because of either really rapid urbanization, where a centralized system can't reach out as far as it needs to without inefficiencies, or just can't get built in time, or that we're working in cities that are fairly low density and decentralization makes a lot of sense. So I think it's partly our geography and the rapidity of urbanization, the scale of it, that's driving towards that. But I also think that there are other more centralized solutions. Decentralization is not a transportation solution, really. And I just wanted to emphasize that there are some of those ideas that I showed, like the Hafen City in Hamburg, that's a centralized solution. Or the Japanese super dike, that's a centralized, a lot of money in that. and it's very local. So I think that there's more than decentralized, and I would be afraid that we would move to a kind of suburbanization model too quickly, which doesn't work for every case.
I mean, cities exist on a razor's edge between organization and disorganization, fundamentally. I mean, they need to be sufficiently disorganized to be creative and inventive, and they need to be sufficiently organized so that we know where we can get off at a subway stop and know that, you know, something will be there. And so I think why I raised the question of robustness versus resilience, I prefer the phrase because it really says, well, in order for cities to be adaptable, we actually need a balance of centralized and decentralized solutions. Some of the topology of one problem of a river exceeding its banks is very different from the topology of stormwater throughout the city, and those solutions need to be, you know, and one of the really remarkable things about cities is that they already exhibit that balance. There's the social network of a city, which is completely flat and inventive, and you get introduced to different people all the time, and that's how cities work. I ran into someone in the Embarcadero yesterday who teaches at the Architectural Association in London, and we never would have encountered each other if not just for the fact that we were both standing on a street corner in a city. And yet, cities also socially have all kinds of hierarchies, and it's the balance between those two things, between the kind of that we need to. I think if you look at if I were to draw, I didn't try to draw a graph today, but I've looked at a lot of graphs today. If I tried to draw a graph, we have, you know, there's a range of solutions from the very centralized to the very decentralized, and we need to make sure we have things to do in all of those different buckets.
I think it's fair to say that we in America are experiencing a loss of faith in public systems and have disinvested in public systems. So those two things really should go together, that we understand that they're not working because we're not paying for them. But in other parts of the world, people aren't feeling that way. In Northern Europe, the state is a developer. The city of Stockholm does development in an integrated fashion and leads. So it's partly the particular context that we're in that you can get into this kind of late capitalism malaise and talk about the failure of the state. But it really is a cultural condition that we're in, I think.
Sure. First of all, I think, you know, most of the water, generally, the water professionals are like plumbers. You know, the urban form is created without any real influence from them, and they plumb the system. And the reason we have these highly gridded systems is because we follow the road layout. I think what we're finding now is that the water professionals want to be in the discussions with urban planners. The energy folks want to be there. The transport people want to be there. So you do have this sort of need for greater collaboration at the city level. And one thing I would say is that there's no religion here. I mean, you know, what we're proposing is a continuum of options. In some cases, a more centralized approach would make sense, and in some cases, a more decentralized system would make sense. But it's this ability to analyze or to consider this spectrum. And that's the critical thing. It tends to be the maths that sort of supports which end of the spectrum you're going to be in. But it's not a religion. It's not like everything's got to be decentralized. I think that would be a big mistake.
I want to thank all the panelists. I think this has been a fascinating session, and one in which engineering ideas and concerns and solutions are really being married to the design of the physical fabric of cities, whether it's, you know, big sand infrastructure or whether it's mobilizing tiny spaces throughout the city to form an infrastructural network. And also thinking about these issues both in a developed world and developing world context, which I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned on both sides, probably more from the South, lessons coming from the South more than the North right now. Unless you want to give the South lessons about what not to do, then that's different. But anyway, I just want to ask everyone to join me in thanking the speakers.